Last week, I asked you all to share your resumes with me. So in this video, I'm going to be critiquing those resumes from my perspective as a software engineer. And as we go through these resumes, what I recommend you do is follow along with your own resume and to see if any of the feedback I give can apply to your resume as well. Now, as a quick disclaimer here, I don't claim to be an expert in resumes in any sense. I'm not a recruiter or an engineering manager, but I have had success with my own resume, as well as I've helped a lot of my friends with their resumes. So I do think I have some level of understanding here, but do still take any information I give with a grain of salt and to make your own decisions based on what you think is best for your own resume. Okay, so let's start with Alberto's resume here. So first of all, on the left, we see you have a bachelor's in science and computer science. One piece of advice here is to also include when you got this degree. So was it last month or was it 15 years ago? That is important information to know when exactly it was you graduated so that somebody can gauge how long your experience has been. And then you also want to include some relevant coursework. So what are the classes that you took, and potentially your GPA if you had a fairly high GPA. Then we have technical skills. So I think this is good: languages, frameworks, cloud platforms. The one thing I would say is additional. Doesn't really mean a whole lot, so you might want to find a better name for this or move some of these items into other categories. So for example, Redux and Node.js could probably go in languages or frameworks. Then you have soft skills. I think it's sort of 50-50 on if you need this on your resume or not. I don't think it's super important, but you can include it if you want. The one here I do see that looks pretty important is that you are bilingual, so I would make sure to include that no matter what. But the other skills here are sort of things that you can show rather than tell. So you can show that you are good at problem solving by having solved problems through your projects, rather than just saying that you are good at this. So then you have some experience, so the Boys and Girls Club, and this looks like it was web development and UI/UX design in July of 2021. So the one thing I would say here is it's not clear if this was a job or if it was some form of volunteer work or maybe some project for a school project, something like that. Just because I know the Boys and Girls Club is a charity, so it's not clear if they actually hired you or if you were volunteering. Either way, it's good to have on the resume, but you should probably mention that, especially when it's only 1 month long. So maybe this was some freelance work, or maybe it was just volunteering. Regardless, I would mention what that was. Then we have some interests and hobbies. Normally, I would say you don't need this on a resume, but it's fine to leave on if you have the space for it. It does have the potential to sort of create some commonality between you and the interviewer. So for example, if your interviewer or recruiter also plays chess, then they might see this and it can be a good conversation starter and just a good way to sort of start out with some commonalities, which is always good. But you don't necessarily need this on your resume. So then you have some technical projects as well as entrepreneurial experience. So one thing I would say is this experience with the Boys and Girls Club is probably the most important thing on your resume because it's the only one with an external organization. So I would probably move this over to the right-hand column, the more sort of important column, and then potentially get rid of one of these projects or just make things a little bit smaller so that it all fits. But I do think that this is the most important one, so I would try to get this main experience to be at the top on the right-hand side, but otherwise these projects all look pretty good. I like that you are including the languages and frameworks that you're using. I might move this to be the bottom bullet point and start with the stronger bullet points of what exactly it is that you did. It's also cool to see some entrepreneurial experience. You definitely don't need this on a resume, but it is cool. So it looks like you have 25,000 monthly visitors to a website, so this is awesome. It also looks like you're doing YouTube, so I love to see that, of course. And overall, this just seems like a pretty good resume, so great work. But now let's move on to the next one. Okay, so in this next one, I believe you pronounced the name Harsh, but I might be wrong about that, so I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. But it looks like he is in India, and this resume is actually 2 pages. So the first thing I would say is most of the time you should only have 1 page for your resume. The second page either just won't get looked at, or it's just going to sort of annoy people that they have to scroll so much through all of these pages. Additionally, the resume might get printed out, in which case you might lose the second page altogether. So unless you have a ton of experience or some research, things like that, stick to a single page. Additionally, at the top here, we have a photo, and I would usually recommend to remove this. Now, one caveat here is this can be different from different cultures. So in the United States, it's usually considered bad practice to have a photo on your resume, but in some countries this might not be the case. I'm not 100% sure about India where this person is, so if in India that's more common, then it could be fine, but at least in the US, I would say to always remove photos. Additionally, we have a professional summary here, which is sort of just taking up a lot of space. And you have to recognize that a recruiter might only spend like 30 seconds on your resume. It's going to take them almost 30 seconds just to read this paragraph. So instead of trying to tell them about yourself, try to show them about yourself through your experience. So usually I would say to just remove this as well. So then we have some contact information on the left, which is fine. Some interests and hobbies, which again is fine if you want to include it. And we have some achievements. And I think this is a little bit odd because there's a single achievement here, but it says achievements plural. Additionally, this isn't related to software engineering at all, so it might just be worth removing if that means getting down to a single page. So then we have some education information. This I think is mostly fine. One thing that's a little confusing to me is that we have this November 2021 and then the vertical bar and then July 2022. So I'm not sure if that's a start date and an end date or two different dates. It's kind of confusing to me as to what this is. And additionally, if you graduated, I would mention what it is you graduated with. Did you get a bachelor's degree here? Was this a high school? I don't know by looking at this. So I would make sure to include that as well as potentially relevant coursework and your GPA if it was high enough. And then next we have technical skills. I think this is fine. Potentially you might want to break this up into sort of subcategories like we saw previously to make it a little bit easier to parse, but I think it's fine how it is as well. And then we have soft skills. Again, I don't think these are really necessary on a resume, but you can include them if you want. But if it means getting down to one page, again, I would remove these. And then you have some work experience. So this looks pretty good to me. It looks like you were a research associate. I do think it's a little bit hard to sort of understand what exactly this is because it's all one font and there's no distinguishing factor between what here's the name of the company, what is your job title, etc. So like we have this ink at the end here. So I would assume this is a company, and then research associate seems like a job title, but then I don't really know what voice means. Is it that you were a research associate for some kind of voice related research, or what exactly does this mean? At first glance, it's just sort of confusing. So maybe I would try to make that more clear. Then we have this vertical bar thing again with the dates. I'm assuming this is a start and end date, but I would just use the normal dash instead of this vertical bar because the vertical bar usually represents like separate things rather than a start and end date. And then we have some bullet points. I would maybe move these over. These are indented really far over to the right, and it just sort of reads a little bit strange, but otherwise I think the bullet points are pretty good. So let's go ahead and move on to the second page here very quickly. So it looks like we have some different projects. But I do think you can actually condense this a lot. The font's pretty big and there's a lot of white space. So like where my mouse is here, there's all this white space. So you can probably condense this to get that down into a single page. But overall, I think this is good. It's just maybe a little bit too much information about all of these. So it says you made an Expedia clone and you describe what Expedia is. So then you describe the features and the tech stack and the responsibility you had. And I think this is just maybe a little bit overkill. So maybe instead of saying this is an Expedia clone and listing out all the features and then describing what your responsibility is, just tell me what it is that you did. Because I don't necessarily care what Expedia is because you didn't work for Expedia. And I don't necessarily care what this entire project was. What I care about is what is the thing that you did? What is the value you brought to this project? And this goes the same way for an actual job, right? So if on my resume I said I worked at Facebook, I'm not going to describe all of the business ventures of Facebook. I'm going to describe what exactly it is that I did at Facebook and how I brought value to the company. So the same thing is sort of true here, even if it's just a project. You can probably remove most of this. So I don't necessarily care about all of these features if you weren't involved in implementing these features. So I would sort of condense these down into just the information that is relevant to you. Okay, so next we have Jet here, and just right off the bat, I really like the formatting of this resume. It's easy to read. I know I can parse this super quickly, so good job on that. So it says you are a front-end software engineer. We have your website, your GitHub, and your LinkedIn, which is fine. You have a phone number here. It's actually not a US phone number, so I'm a little interested about that. But anyways, you have a non-US phone number, but it says you are based in Tampa. And then we have this sort of professional overview or objective statement, whatever you want to call it. And this, again, is something I would usually recommend just removing. So for example, it says front-end software engineer with 5 years of experience, but I can see that very clearly just from the fact that you had your first front-end engineering job in 2017. So I don't necessarily need you to retell me that. I can see that in the other information. So essentially you can leave it if you want, but usually my recommendation would be to remove that. And next you have skills, so we have languages, front-end, back-end, and testing. So one thing I might recommend is to change up these categories a little bit, because for example, you have back-end here with only one thing in it, which seems like a little bit of a waste of space to have this whole line just for the fact that you know Node.js. Additionally, with the testing, I'm a little bit confused here by the last part where it just says testing library. I don't know what this means. Is this a specific library called testing library, or are you just saying you know how to test? So for example, Jest is a testing library on its own, so I don't know what the purpose is of saying testing library after that, but if it is its own thing, that is fine. It might just be something I don't know about. But anyways, moving on, we have technical experience, so senior front-end engineer, and then it has some bullet points, which I think are really good bullet points. These are some of the best I've seen so far. So we start with all of these strong verbs, we describe what you did, and then it says sort of the outcome, which is quantified. So increased net profit by 15%. So great job with these bullet points. You also have the date and the location. I'm a little interested about how this is saying that you currently work in New York, but then at the top here, it says you're based in Tampa, Florida. So that's a little bit confusing to me, but if you are working remotely for a New York-based company out of Tampa or something, I guess that makes sense. The one thing I would say with the technical experience with these bottom two, and it looks like these are actually in Russia, which is pretty interesting, but with these two, it doesn't have any bullet points, so you're not really describing what you did here. So either remove them completely or include bullet points. And most likely, I would say to include bullet points, especially because it looks like you worked here for 2 years. So you want to include that, but you want to describe what exactly it is that you did, not that you were just a front-end engineer. There is a lot of blank space at the bottom of the resume here, so there's definitely room to add a few bullet points. Next, you have your education. You have a master's degree in engineering from a university. I will assume this is probably in Russia. But one thing I will say, like I've said before, is I would probably include some relevant coursework here, as well as potentially including your GPA, depending on how high it was. And next you have this activities section, which is good, but I think it might be underselling yourself a little bit. By just calling these activities, they feel like hobbies or something of that nature, whereas these are actually related activities. So for example, if most of this is volunteer experience, then maybe rename the whole section to volunteering and just include those volunteering experiences. But just saying activities feels like they are hobbies, whereas these actually feel pretty impressive. Maybe some of them also even deserve some bullet points to explain what they are. But anyways, moving on, at the bottom, we have some visa information. I'm not sure if this is standard to include on a resume or not, but I will trust that you know what you're doing here, so that seems fine to me. And overall, I think this is a very good resume. Okay, so this next resume is once again in India. At the top here, we have another one of these sort of objective statements. And again, I would probably recommend removing this, but it is, of course, up to you. And next, we have this projects and open source. And the biggest issue I see here is just the font. I would try to make this a little bit bigger. You have a lot of white space over here on the right, so there is room to make it bigger, so I would try to do that. But anyways, looking at the actual bullets, looks like we have Girl script, Summer of Code, you were a contributor. I don't know if contributor is the best way to describe this, because I don't know what that means. How did you contribute? Did you contribute by doing software engineering? Did you contribute by managing in some sense? Or did you contribute by bringing snacks? I don't know. So by just saying contributor, I sort of have to assume that you did the minimal amount, which probably isn't true. So I think you might be underselling yourself with the word contributor. And then as I move on, it looks like some of these just say project. And in that case, if it's just a project, I don't know that you necessarily need the word project there. Maybe break this section up into 2 different sections, personal projects and open source contributions. So now I'm seeing that contributor likely means that this is an open source project. So maybe that's something you should do there instead, is say open source contributions as its own section so that it's assumed that that's what this is. Moving on, we have some skills. So programming languages, web technologies, frameworks and libraries, databases, and tools. I think this is actually pretty good. One thing I would say is there's a lot of things here. So maybe you want to get a little bit more niche, but it's up to you. But one thing that I did when I was making my resumes is I sort of list off pretty much every language, framework, etc. that I had ever worked with. And I don't think this actually was beneficial. It just makes it seem like you aren't an expert in anything. So it might be better to try and really be an expert in one thing, but it is up to you and what you want to do. Then you have some education. So it looks like you have a bachelor's in computer science and engineering, and you have a GPA here. I believe in India, GPAs are often out of 10, so I'm assuming that's what that is. The one thing I would say, again, is potentially you might want to include some related coursework. Additionally, this was in 2022, so this is very recent. So potentially move education all the way up to the top. So if you are a new grad or a current student, education's sort of the most important thing that you are currently doing. So I would put it at the top of the resume. But then as you get more experience, you can move it more down the resume towards the bottom as it becomes less relevant. So then you have some achievements and certification. So I would potentially, just as a small nitpick here, either make both of these plural or both of them singular. So either achievements and certifications or achievement and certification. I think it's a little bit odd that one's plural and one's not. Maybe it's because there's multiple achievements and one certification. But regardless, it just reads a little bit strange to me. But anyways, we have, I'm not sure exactly what this is, TechFest. It looks like you were a finalist. And then you have the certifications below here. So yeah, I think it looks like there's multiple certifications, so you can make this plural or even break it up into two different sections. I would also maybe work on some of the spacing. So there's a lot of space between this title here and this title here. There's just a lot of vertical space. So you can probably condense that a little bit, which is going to make it easier for you to increase the font size, which is going to just improve the readability of the entire resume a lot. Okay, so next we have, I believe, Sunav is how I would assume you pronounce this one, and it's another resume in India. So at the top here we have education, which is great because it looks like you are currently a student. So this is a great time to have education all the way at the top. Bachelor's degree in computer science and a GPA of 9.88, which I believe again is out of 10. So that is amazing. Awesome to sort of showcase that you've done so well in school. Again, you might want to include some relevant coursework, especially as a current student. Relevant coursework is super important because they don't know how much of your computer science degree education you've actually done so far. So it's important to say, hey, I've taken these relevant classes to the job I'm applying for. Next, you have some experience. So it looks like you did an internship, or actually you did two internships. So that's awesome to see. Both of them were remote, and we have the dates. So this is all really good. And it looks like we have some pretty good bullet points as well. So we have some strong verbs. Then you describe what you did, and then you have some metrics that are even in bold, so that's great. I'm always sort of on the edge about bold in a resume, but I do think it's fine if you prefer it. So yeah, overall, I think these experience points are great. I would maybe say work experience instead of just experience to be super clear that these aren't projects or anything like that, but it is obviously pretty clear by the title down here. Next, we have skills, and in skills, it looks like you actually have relevant coursework, so I would just move this up into education below the university so that you can say that this is the coursework from this university, because that's sort of how these two things are connected. Taking a course isn't really a skill. The skills are the things you gain from the courses. And then we have the actual skills, so programming languages, libraries and frameworks, developer tools, and databases. Overall, I think this is great. I would maybe work on formatting a little bit. So for example, between get and rest, there's no space after the comma, and then between yarn and npm, there is a space after yarn before the comma. So just cleaning up that little bit of formatting will make everything look a lot more professional. Next, you have projects and open source. So this is good. It looks like you have a project here. You describe exactly what you used for the project, so the different languages and APIs and things that you've used. Then you have another project down below it. One thing I would say is it's not super clear just looking at this, which ones are projects, which ones are open source, or are they just both open source projects? So maybe make that a little bit more clear. Additionally, this long list of programming languages and APIs and whatnot, I think it's fine to include, but the way it goes to 2 lines is just, to me, showing that it's too much. So maybe remove the specific APIs, because no one's hiring somebody just because they know how to use the OpenWeather API, for example. Showing that you've used open source APIs is good, but I don't know that you necessarily need to put so much emphasis on these specific APIs. Additionally, you have those APIs listed down here anyways, so it's sort of just redundant to have them in 2 places. And I think having this all on one line at the top here would look a lot cleaner. So yeah, we'd probably just remove the APIs and potentially also include dates. So what was the time frame when you completed these projects? So then at the bottom, we have honors and awards. So I think this is fine. Maybe you should have bullet points here, because it's just a little bit unclear where one of the honors and awards ends and where the next one begins. Obviously, I can sort of assume that each line is its own honor or award, but I do think it'd just be a little bit cleaner if you separated them by bullet points or something of that nature. But overall, I think this is good. I'm not sure how I feel about including the number of LeetCode problems you've solved on a resume. But I do think it's fine if it's something you want to do, if it's something you're proud of, because obviously that is a lot of work to solve 350 problems. But it does just feel a little bit like a strange thing to have on a resume, but up to you if you want to keep it on there. Okay, so that is going to be the last resume we look at, but if you do want to see my resume and the progression of that resume that landed me jobs at companies like Facebook, then check out this video over here. Otherwise, make sure to like the video if you want to see more of these, and I will see you in the next one.